Hi, it's me, the deceiving slut of classical music. Welcome back to Musical Review. Today we're going to be looking at 3 Summers of Lincoln. This show probably doesn't sound familiar to you, and that's because right now it's off-Broadway, playing at the La Jolla Playhouse. If you're a theater kid and you don't know what the La Jolla Playhouse is, what's wrong with you? It's one of the biggest off-Broadway theaters in America and has started a lot of musicals that went straight to Broadway after playing there. Most notably, for example, Rent started at the La Jolla Playhouse. And as a theater kid growing up in Southern California, you often hear rumors about shows being played at the La Jolla Playhouse that are said to go to Broadway. And you know, about half the time-ish, it actually does. Now, 3 Summers of Lincoln is the first show that I ever saw at the La Jolla Playhouse. And this was pretty recent, like a month ago. So does the show live up to the hype? Is this one more of many shows that goes on to be a massive hit on Broadway? I'll get to that, but first I want to start with a brief synopsis of the show, very short. The show is essentially about Lincoln dragging his feet on making the Civil War about slavery. The first number of the show is called 90-Day War. This is because when the Civil War started, Lincoln told the army that it was just going to be a 90-day war. You know, just go in, kill all the Southerners, be home by Christmas. And in the summer of 1861, when this musical starts, the war had already been going on for longer than 90 days, and the North was losing. And at this point, Lincoln didn't want to make the war about slavery. There are 2 main reasons for this. 1, Lincoln didn't think he had the constitutional power as president to end slavery, and 2, he knew that a lot of the soldiers didn't support emancipation, and he didn't want to lose his army. The other main character in the show is Frederick Douglass. At this point, he's writing and publishing his own newspaper called the North Star, and most of what he's doing is just shitting on Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, Frederick Douglass wants to make the war about slavery, and he wants Lincoln to allow black men to fight in the Union Army. So most of Frederick Douglass's character is just shitting on Lincoln. Now, other important characters include Mary Todd Lincoln, who's Abraham Lincoln's wife. She just lost her son from, I don't know, like the fucking plague or something. And that's kind of put her out of commission. She doesn't really help the Civil War in Act 1 because she's too busy grieving. Not only that, she fights with Abraham because Abraham's like, come on, we're kind of fighting a war here. I know our son died and that's sad and everything, but like we need to grow up. There's more important things going on. And Mary Todd thinks he's heartless for not grieving their son more. I don't know. She's really weird. She tries to like seance their son via a medium. It's like some hereditary shit. Another important character is William Slade, who's Abraham Lincoln's advisor and good friend. And he's a black dude. This becomes important later in the story. He's obviously an advisor first, but he and Abraham Lincoln get along very well, and they act out scenes from Shakespeare and shit. It's pretty funny. And Private Putnam, who kind of serves as Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard, and he kind of represents the Union Army soldier. Lincoln goes to him whenever he wants to gauge the thoughts of the army. So Act 1 takes place in the summer of 1862, and for the reasons I mentioned earlier, Lincoln is doing everything in his power to not make the war about slavery. One scene shows Abraham Lincoln's racist side. He organizes a meeting with a bunch of black reverends and basically says, hey, since there's a lot of racism in this country, and you're the race that people are being racist to, this whole conflict is kind of your fault, so why don't we make the solution all African Americans go to the Caribbean and live there instead of here, and that just solves the problem. So Abraham Lincoln is cautious to a fault. He doesn't want to do anything radical, and he definitely sacrifices his morality for it. And Frederick Douglass serves to be the foil of Abraham Lincoln in a positive way. Frederick Douglass is full radical, almost to the point where he doesn't care about the pragmatic or practicality of emancipation. He doesn't care whose feelings get hurt or whose feathers get ruffled. One of the most memorable lines of the show to me, Abraham Lincoln was talking about how it's unconstitutional for him to emancipate the slaves. And Frederick Douglass says, this is why you don't elect a lawyer as president. He says it's not constitutional. Well, guess what? If something's in the Constitution is unjust, you change the damn Constitution. But at this point, Frederick Douglass isn't really a powerful figure yet. He has quite a following with his North Star newspaper, but not a lot of political connections. Anyways, while Lincoln is grappling with his own internal struggles about the issue of slavery, the North is losing the Civil War. The North is largely losing the Civil War because Lincoln's general, George B. McClellan, sucks ass. George B. McClellan is basically the antagonist of the show. You know, he gets the big I am number called Sent by God, where basically he says he was sent by God to be the Union general. Although he's kind of a Charles Lee figure in that he's overly cautious and sucks ass and is losing hard. George B. McClellan is compared to Trump in this musical in the way that he is complacent and very full of himself, while at the same time his actions don't back up his words. He talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. And he's compared to Trump twice. Once when he's running for president and says he will make America great again, and another time when he's talking, he does the little Trump hand gesture. You know what it is. Anyways, Act 1 ends with the Battle of Antietam and Lincoln signing into law that escaped slaves can now fight for the Union Army. Abraham Lincoln also fires General George McClellan and replaces him with a general who also sucks, but that's besides the point. That's not covered in this musical. In Act 2, Lincoln is still having all his internal struggles. He's still struggling to win the war, and now he has another problem, which is that George B. McClellan is running against him in the presidential election. And it really looks like Abraham Lincoln is screwed because this war has been going on for so long, it's been so deadly, and General George B. McClellan was running on a platform to end the war. Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and knowing that even in the North that still was not a popular decision, by all accounts he was going to lose the election. But miraculously, after the Battle of Gettysburg, there is a revived support for the war and for Lincoln, and he wins the election. Surprisingly, 80% of the soldiers vote to re-elect Lincoln. The show ends in 1864 when the war is all but over and the South is getting destroyed. And Lincoln finally comes around to radicalism and the equality of the races. Now, having seen this musical, do I think it is going to go straight to Broadway and be the Civil War Hamilton? No. This musical has some pros and cons for sure. I'll start with the pros. I think the biggest pro for me is the historicity. I was a history major in college, went to UCLA, so I can appreciate when a musical tells history really well, and this one does. At the very start of the musical, the first thing we see is a soldier with a peg leg walk on stage, and he starts tap dancing Morse code. This is already history major fan service because the Civil War was the first major conflict since the invention of the telegraph, and that allowed people to communicate. You know, say for example, it allowed Lincoln to communicate with his general even when Lincoln was at the Capitol and the generals were on the battlefield. A screen behind the tap dancing soldier says how many days the war has been going on for and the number of casualties. It shows the number of days the war has been going on for, obviously to contrast with Lincoln's promise that this was going to be a 90-day war at the start of it. The number of casualties may not seem super intuitive if you never took APUSH, but to get the point across, let's play a little game of trivia. What was the deadliest conflict in US history? Is it A, World War I, B, the Civil War, C, World War II, or D, Vietnam? Surprisingly, the answer is the Civil War. Not only does the Civil War have the highest number of American casualties of any of those conflicts, it has more American casualties than World War I and World War II combined. So several times throughout the show, the peg leg guy comes out on stage and we get to see the length of the war and the casualties just go higher and higher to absurd numbers. And that's a really cool way to create a sense of urgency. It's really painful to see Lincoln dragging his feet on these issues when you see how many people are dying and they don't even know what they're dying for. It also kind of makes you hate McClellan, who's so self-obsessed, when you see the amount of people that are dying under his leadership. Also, it's really interesting the way Abraham Lincoln is portrayed. Mainstream US history sees Abraham Lincoln as a hero who freed the slaves and believed in equality between the races, but that's not really true. All the racist stuff that Abraham Lincoln does in this musical, how reluctant he was to free the slaves, and how he would have preferred to simply deport all the slaves to the Caribbean or anywhere else, all of that is true. By the time Abraham Lincoln does actually sign the Emancipation Proclamation, he's already done everything in his power to not do that. And of course, Frederick Douglass's standpoint of radicalism and throwing caution to the wind and throwing tradition to the wind when it comes to what you believe is right was also very accurate to Frederick Douglass as a person in real life. And sprinkled throughout the musical are different moments of shit that's important to history, you know, like the invention of the Gatling gun, General Sherman's march to Atlanta. In short, you can really tell that the writers of this show have done their research. Some parts of the show are also very entertaining. You're never having a bad time when George B. McClellan is prancing around the stage, singing about how he was sent by God and is the greatest person in US history. And it's thoroughly satisfying when he gets fired by Lincoln and loses the election. But of course, we're all really here for the problems with the show, so time to talk about those. The biggest problem with the show is the music. Let me play for you a clip of the first song called 90 Day War. A nation on the edge, on the verge, the center can't hold, when two ideas can't merge. And all I want you to do is just kind of keep that example in your mind, remember the melody. So the music to the show is bluesy, but not in the Hadestown kind of bluesy. It definitely has a modern musical theater twist to it. It's kind of like if Dear Evan Hansen was blues or something. It has some elements of pop and rock. As far as rock goes, I kind of got the same impression as I do with a lot of new musicals, which is just, you know, they kind of put an electric guitar in it and they call it rock music. And the music is never really bad. It's not like you listen to it and cringe because you're like, that doesn't sound very good. The thing is though with the music is it only happens like once or twice that a single bar of music gets repeated in the same song. In other words, most of the songs don't really seem to have a structure. They just kind of meander. There is no verse-chorus structure. There really aren't any repeated figures. What it feels like is, it feels like someone wrote a character monologue and then gave it to the composer, and the composer turned that monologue into a melody and they wrote music around it. And because of this, it is very forgettable. I leaned over to my girlfriend during the intermission, she saw the show with me, and said, "Can you recall a single melody of music that we just heard in that entire first act?" And she couldn't, and neither could I. Because it's not really written to be catchy or to follow any kind of popular structure. It more so feels like talking with a melody. And I'm not saying every song should follow like a simple verse, chorus, pop music kind of structure. I'm just saying sometimes you have to repeat things in order for the audience to remember them. Let's take Hamilton for an example. The first song, Alexander Hamilton, doesn't follow verse-chorus format, but you still remember it. For example, you're still humming, "In New York you can be a new man," by the time you leave the theater. Whereas in this show, we couldn't remember what song was playing 5 minutes ago. And I've made this argument before, but if the audience can't remember your music, then you have to question how much of an effect it really had on them in the first place. Because the music was a little bit spotty in this way, my girlfriend said that this musical would be so much better as a play. And the more I think about it, the more I agree with her. One of the problems I have with how the story is told, is this is a Civil War story. But not once in the entire show do we see a Confederate. Now, I think the reasoning here is that this musical is supposed to be more about Lincoln's internal struggles, with his generals and coping with doing something that is unconstitutional. But that's not very fun for a musical. In a musical, we want bad guys. We want the guys who we want to fuck up and we want to see get fucked up. Here's the thing. Why do we have music in musicals in the first place? People who are familiar with how musicals work will tell you you put in songs where the energy starts to ramp up. Music helps ramp up the energy. It gets the audience excited. It gets the adrenaline going. And therefore, in a musical, we want a bit more spectacle. Because in the audience, your adrenaline's going, your heart's beating, you're ready for shit to go down. So it's a little bit of a cock tease when you get so excited, and then when the song's over, you just get dialectics about the constitutionality of emancipation. My favorite song from the show was a 30-second song sung by the Soldier Ensemble called Marching Towards Georgia. And this song is about William Tecumseh Sherman's march on Atlanta during the Civil War. This march was scorched earth, so William wasn't trying to have a battle with anyone. He was just trying to get into the South and fucking burn down and destroy everything in his path. So in the song, they're singing about burning Dixie to the ground. This is one of the last songs of the show, and when I heard it, I thought, finally, I have something to channel all this energy that I've had for this entire show. I get fighting, I get to see beating up the bad guys. This is what I've wanted this whole time. Because at the end of the day, the show does have a bad guy. The bad guy is George McClellan, and we do get to see his plans get foiled, and we get to watch him fail or whatever. But George B. McClellan isn't really wrong, he's just misguided. It does feel good to watch him fail, but you know it would feel even better if I got to see Confederates walk out and sing a song like, "You're not gonna take our slaves," and then I get to see a battle where they all fucking die. So again, this would be better as a play. The music gets you super pumped up, excited, makes you want to fight, makes you want to see a battle. But there is no battle in this show. This show is a bit more cerebral. This show is about internal struggles rather than external struggles. And those kind of stories will do better as plays where your objective is not to get the audience hyped, pumped, and excited. I think for the other problems of the show, most of it is that there are elements that are either superfluous or very corny. For example, Mary Todd Lincoln's arc about overcoming grief really doesn't seem super relevant to the story of the show, because I would get it if she overcame grief and then came to help Lincoln with emancipation in a meaningful way, but she's not the one who convinces Lincoln. In fact, most of the show is about the rivalry between Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, and they come to respect each other greatly, and I do think the show depicts Frederick Douglass's effect on Lincoln, but in the story, it doesn't seem like Frederick Douglass is the main person to convince Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. The person who does that is his advisor and friend William Slade, because this is Lincoln's best buddy. He's a black guy, and when Lincoln's dragging his feet on signing the Emancipation Proclamation, Slade gets really cold to him. He basically says he's not going to be Lincoln's friend anymore, and that's what has the biggest effect on Lincoln out of anyone or anything else in the show. He doesn't want to lose his buddy, and having such close proximity to a black person makes Abraham Lincoln more willing to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. So I think it's alright to have these characters like Frederick Douglass and Mary Todd Lincoln in the show, but I think their effects on Lincoln are very much underplayed, and there's too much emphasis that's put on William Slade. If you're gonna have these other characters, they need to have just as much stake in Lincoln's decision, and they need to have just as much of an effect on Lincoln. Also, there's another really corny part of the show. So Private Putnam, the guy who is Abraham Lincoln's bodyguard, at one point in the show decides that he doesn't want to sit around guarding Lincoln all day, but he wants to actually go out on the battlefield and be a soldier. And Lincoln gives him basically a long lecture about how dangerous it is and how he wants Putnam to be careful. And then Putnam dies, and, people feel sad about him dying. But when you really read between the lines, when Abraham Lincoln was telling him to be careful, Abraham Lincoln was basically saying, if you go out there, if you fight them, you are going to die. And then Putnam's like, no, I'm gonna go out and serve my country because I love you, Lincoln. And Lincoln says, Putnam, you are going to die. Another reason why I think the show would work better as a play is because in the musical, when we see Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, they're already pretty much at the heights of their career. Lincoln is already president, and Frederick Douglass is already the publisher of a very well-known and successful newspaper. In these musicals that are semi-biographical, I kind of feel like the audience wants to see them come up from nothing. Because Frederick Douglass especially has one of the most interesting backstories as an escaped slave. And Lincoln was also some fucking country rube from like Kentucky. It would be much more exciting to see them at their lowest and their most ambitious and see them achieve their success. And I think seeing them both come up from nothing would really drive home the respect that they have for each other when they meet each other and get to know each other. Now, you may notice that a lot of my problems with the show basically boil down to make it more like Hamilton. You know, give us more battles, give us more muskets, give us the entire backstory and rise to power of the characters. And that's true. That's not wrong. That would make the show a lot more like Hamilton. And I think really what the problem with the show is that it's a U.S. history musical. And if you're going to do a biographical U.S. history musical, it is going to look a lot like Hamilton. There's a reason why Hamilton is successful. It works very well as a musical. It has all the elements that make a musical work well. So if you're going to do a musical that is about U.S. history, it's going to look a lot like Hamilton if you want to do it well. Funnily enough, this exact story pretty much is something that I contemplated writing into a musical. A few years back, I read a book called The President and the Freedom Fighter, I believe. And you know, I write musicals, so whenever I read books, in the back of my mind, there's always something going, I wonder if this would make a good musical. And my answer then was no. And what it really came down to is, since Hamilton, US history musicals just aren't gonna work as well. Because no matter how good your musical is, no matter how authentic and original, you will always get, it's like Hamilton. And that's just another reason why this would work better as a play than a musical. As for these reasons, I'm pretty sure this one's not going to Broadway. It doesn't have any songs that really catch your eye. And at the end of the day, it's a U.S. history musical. It can either stay in the state it is, which is kind of mid, or you can make it better, which would also make it look more like Hamilton. And I don't think Broadway is really gonna just keep recycling U.S. history musicals over and over and over again. So I think really no matter what you do with it, this musical's doomed. I think it would make a great play though. Also, hey, here's a problem with the music. Let me read to you the program. So, you know, in Act 1, it looks real normal. But in Act 2, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 reprises. There are 8 reprises, and there are a couple of reprise 2s, which means that there was a song. They did a reprise of that song, and then they did another song, which was a reprise of that original song. I think there are more reprises in Act 2 than there are new songs. And as far as corniness goes, one of the last songs of the show is called A Radical Shouts Now, and it's Abraham Lincoln, and I just remember the line to this song was, while a liberal relies on later, a radical shouts now. And that's the corniest shit I've ever heard. Sometimes I'll just be sitting with my girlfriend, and if there's a silent moment, I'll just be like, God, I'm so fucking sick of these liberals relying on later. Don't they know a radical shouts now? And also, that's a song about radicalism. Why the fuck are you giving it to Abraham Lincoln, the guy who's been established as the conservative moderate one for the entire show? Why do you not give that song to Frederick Douglass, the one who you've established as a radical? But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this musical review. I know it's a little bit of an interesting one since it's off Broadway and doesn't have like any buzz yet. If there are any other fun, funky musicals that you want me to review, just drop it in the comments. Thank you and break legs.